The slap echoed louder than the motorcycles. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't playful. It was deliberate. Right there in the middle of the street, surrounded by roaring engines and leather jackets. Two bikers laughed as one of them slapped Steven Seagal across the cheek, hard. For half a second, the world froze. Traffic slowed. A waitress dropped a tray. Someone across the street whispered, "Did that really just happen?" The bikers were already laughing again. "Hey, you okay, old man?" one of them sneered. Another added, "Careful. Might knock the dentures loose next time." Phones came out. People love moments like this, when they think they're about to watch someone get humiliated. Steven stood still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't even touch his face. Instead, he slowly turned his head back to center and breathed out. That calm made people uncomfortable. One biker leaned in closer, grinning. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." The second biker stepped forward, towering over him. "You should have stayed in the diner, Grandpa," Steven finally spoke. His voice was low, flat, almost gentle. "You shouldn't have done that." The bikers burst out laughing. "Ooh, we're scared now." "Did you hear that?" He warned us. Someone in the crowd muttered. "This is going to get ugly, but not the way anyone expected." Steven looked at both men, not with anger, not with fear, but with something colder. Assessment. Like a man measuring distance, like a man counting seconds. The biker who had slapped him lifted his hand again. "Let's see if you're still calm after." He never finished the sentence, because in that exact moment, something changed. The air felt heavier. The laughter stopped mid-breath, and a strange silence rolled across the street, as if everyone instinctively knew they were about to witness something they couldn't take back. Steven shifted his weight, just slightly. And in less than 1 second, both bikers would hit the ground harder than they'd ever hit anything in their lives. But that hadn't happened yet. The diner had always been quiet at that hour. Not empty, but calm. The kind of place where the coffee never stopped flowing, and the grill never cooled down. Truckers, locals, a few travelers passing through. Nobody bothered anyone. That was the unspoken rule until the bikers arrived. They came in loud. Engines snarling, exhaust popping, music blasting from speakers strapped to handlebars. One by one, they rolled into the parking lot like they owned it. Bikes lining up crooked, deliberately blocking spaces. Conversation inside the diner slowed. People glanced through the windows, then quickly looked back down at their plates. Everyone recognized the type. Leather vests, patches sewn tight, boots heavy enough to sound like threats with every step. They weren't there for food. They were there to be seen. When the door swung open, laughter spilled inside before the men did. A few bikers stayed outside, revving engines for no reason at all. Others pushed in, filling the diner with noise and the smell of fuel and sweat. The waitress forced a smile. "Booth or counter?" she asked. "Wherever we want," one biker said, not stopping. They took up 3 booths spread out like a claim. Helmets dumped on tables. One man kicked a chair aside just to hear it scrape still. No one said anything, except one man. He sat alone at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. His posture was relaxed, almost careless, elbows loose, shoulders low. He looked like someone who had nowhere else to be. Simple jeans, an old jacket, no rings, no chains, nothing that screamed importance. It was Steven Seagal, to anyone who didn't know him. He was just another older guy passing through. Maybe retired, maybe tired. The kind of man people overlooked without trying. One biker noticed him watching the reflection in the window. "Got a staring problem," he called out. Steven didn't respond. He wasn't staring, just aware. There's a difference, and people who've never needed awareness don't recognize it. The biker scoffed and turned back to his group. Plates clattered. Chairs scraped. A bottle tipped and rolled, spilling beer across the floor. Nobody apologized. Steven finished his coffee and placed a few bills on the counter. He nodded once to the waitress, polite, quiet, and stood. That's when things shifted. As Steven passed behind one of the booths, a biker stretched his leg out just enough to block the aisle. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. Steven stopped. The biker looked up, smirking. "Careful, old man." Steven stepped to the side, giving him space. That should have been the end of it. But humiliation feeds on silence. Outside, the parking lot was chaos. Bikes rumbling, engines blipping, men shouting over each other just to prove they could. Steven walked toward his car, a modest sedan parked at the far edge of the lot. That's when the same biker followed him out. "Hey," he shouted. "You didn't say sorry." Steven turned slightly. "For what?" "For disrespect," the biker said, puffing out his chest. "You walked past like we weren't even there." Steven studied him calmly. Not the face, the stance, the balance, the hands. "I wasn't disrespecting you," Steven said. "I was leaving." That answer didn't satisfy them. Another biker joined in, circling from the side. "What's your problem, huh? You think you're better than us?" Steven shook his head once. "I don't think about you at all." That was when the slap came, not fast, not tactical. Just mean, a sharp crack across Steven's cheek that echoed off metal and glass. The bikers laughed like children who'd gotten away with something. Steven didn't stumble, didn't reach for his face, didn't raise his hands. He stood there breathing slow, eyes steady. People nearby froze. Someone whispered his name without knowing why. Another person started recording, hands shaking. The bikers mistook the calm for fear. They always do. They didn't know that this quiet wasn't submission. It was preparation. And while they laughed, while engines growled and adrenaline rose, Steven did something almost invisible. He shifted his weight, just enough, because long before the slap, long before the laughter, this moment had already been decided. The laughter didn't stop right away. It took a second for the sound to drain from the parking lot. Like air escaping a punctured tire, engines still rumbled. Someone whooped. Another biker clapped the man who'd done the slapping on the shoulder. "See?" he said. Didn't even flinch. Steven stood exactly where he was. Still balanced, calm. The man who had slapped him rolled his shoulder, loosening up, enjoying the attention. "You good?" he mocked. "Or you want another one?" Steven finally lifted his eyes to meet his, not angry. Not offended, just focused. "You should step back," Steven said quietly. The biker leaned in instead. That was the mistake. What happened next didn't look dramatic. There was no wind-up, no cinematic spin, no warning that the brain could register in time. Steven moved. Step not forward, not back, but slightly offline. His body turned just enough to remove itself from the path of the next swing. At the same moment, his left hand came up, not to strike, but to redirect. The biker's arm never reached full extension. Steven's hand caught the wrist. Not hard, not soft, just precise. His other hand pressed against the biker's elbow, and his hips rotated. There was a sharp, hollow sound, not a snap, but a lock. The biker gasped as his knees buckled under him, his balance evaporating as if the ground had tilted. Before he hit the asphalt, Steven was already moving again. The second biker rushed in. Adrenaline loud, fists high, confidence unchecked. Steven didn't look at his face. He watched his feet. As the man lunged, Steven stepped inside the strike, close enough that the punch lost power. His shoulder dropped, his weight shifted, and his forearm pressed across the biker's chest, while his hand controlled the neck knot choking. Positioning. Steven turned. The biker's own momentum did the rest. His boots left the ground for a fraction of a second before his body slammed down hard. The sound dull and final, like a sack of grain hitting concrete. Silence. No cheering. No laughter. Just the ticking of hot engines and a few stunned breaths. Both bikers were on the ground. One clutched his arm, eyes wide, teeth clenched, shock overtaking bravado. The other lay on his side, trying to suck air back into lungs that refused to cooperate. Steven released his grip and stepped back. It had taken less than a second. The crowd didn't move. Someone's phone slipped from their fingers and hit the pavement. A waitress stood frozen in the doorway, one hand over her mouth. A man near the pumps whispered, "What just happened?" The other bikers stared, confusion fighting instinct. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were used to fear, to people backing away, to shouting and chaos. They were not used to efficiency. They were not used to silence. Steven straightened his jacket. His cheek was red now. the mark of the slap visible, but unimportant. He looked at the remaining bikers, his gaze steady and unchallenging. "I warned you," he said, not loudly, not proudly, just truthfully. No one stepped forward. A few took half steps back without realizing it. One biker helped another to his feet, eyes never leaving Steven. Engines idled lower, like animals sensing a shift in hierarchy. Steven walked to his car, each step unhurried, each movement loose, unthreatened. He unlocked the door and paused, glancing once more at the two men on the ground. "This ends here," he said. Then he got in. The car door closed with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet lot. The engine started. Tires rolled. Steven drove away. Only after he disappeared down the road did the noise return. Voices overlapping, questions tumbling out, adrenaline shaking loose. No one chased him, no one followed. Because everyone there understood the same thing at the same time. That slap hadn't been answered with anger. It had been answered with skill. And the difference between the two was everything. For several long seconds after the car disappeared, no one moved. The parking lot felt wrong, like a room after an argument where the shouting stopped too suddenly. Engines idled low, rumbling unevenly. The smell of hot oil and burnt coffee hung in the air. One of the bikers finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" No one answered him. The man on the ground with the twisted arm tried to sit up and immediately hissed in pain, his bravado draining fast. Another biker crouched beside him, unsure whether to help or just watch. "Don't move it," someone muttered. "I think it's messed up." The second biker, the one who'd hit the ground hardest, rolled onto his back and stared up at the sky, blinking like he'd just woken from a bad dream. He sucked in air in short, panicked bursts. "I couldn't breathe," he rasped. "I couldn't, easy," another biker said, though his voice lacked conviction. Around them, the crowd began to unfreeze. The waitress rushed out, apron flapping, eyes wide. "Is everyone okay?" she asked. Though it was clear they weren't, a trucker shook his head slowly, still staring down the road where the car had vanished. "I've seen fights," he said to no one in particular. That wasn't a fight. Phones that had been raised earlier were now lowered. A few people replayed what they'd recorded, scrubbing back frame by frame, trying to understand how two large men had gone down so fast. "There was no punch," someone whispered. "He didn't even look mad," said another. The bikers stood in a loose circle, their earlier swagger gone. Jackets hung heavier now, helmets stayed on the ground. No one laughed. One man finally said what everyone was thinking. "Who was that guy?" No answer came right away. Then someone near the diner door spoke up, quiet, certain. That was Steven Seagal. Heads turned. "What? No way." "Seriously." A man pulled out his phone, hands still shaking, and typed the name. He looked from the screen to the road and back again. "Yeah," he said, "that's him." The realization spread differently than fear. It wasn't panic, it was embarrassment. Not because of the name, but because of the mistake. They replayed it in their heads now. The calm, the warning, the absence of ego, the way he'd stepped, not rushed, the way it had ended before it even started. A siren sounded in the distance. Someone had called it in. The bikers exchanged looks. No one suggested running. No one argued. One man quietly helped the injured biker sit upright. Another fetched water from the diner. When the police arrived, they didn't find a crime scene in chaos. They found a group of men unusually subdued. Statements were taken. Witnesses spoke, videos were shown. The officers listened, eyebrows lifting slightly, then settling back into neutral professionalism. "And the other man?" one officer asked. "He left," someone said. "Didn't say much." The officer nodded, jotting it down. There were no arrests that day, no dramatic conclusions, just citations, an ambulance, and a long silence where confidence had once been. As the bikes eventually rolled out, quieter now, engines restrained, the parking lot returned to what it had been before. Just a diner, just a road, just another afternoon. But for the people who had been there, something had shifted. They'd learned something without being taught. That power doesn't always announce itself. That calm isn't weakness. That some people don't need to prove who they are, because they already know. And somewhere down the highway, A man drove on, untouched by the noise he'd left behind. Because for him, it was already over the moment the slap landed. By the time the diner's parking lot returned to normal, the moment had already started to change in people's minds. At first, they replayed it like a highlight, slow motion, frame by frame. Who moved first? How fast it happened. How two men twice his size ended up on the ground without a single wild swing. But as the hours passed, the excitement faded. What remained was discomfort. The waitress couldn't stop thinking about the slap, not the takedown. The slap, the casual cruelty of it. The way it had been done for laughs, for dominance, for nothing at all. The trucker who'd witnessed everything told the story again that night at another stop. But this time, he didn't dramatize it. He just shook his head and said, "I've never seen someone end a situation so completely without needing to win." Online, the videos spread. Comments flooded in. Some praised the skill. Others argued about whether the bikers deserved it. A few tried to turn it into a debate about toughness, but buried beneath the noise was a quieter truth most people felt, even if they didn't say it out loud. The moment didn't matter because of who the man was. It mattered because of who he wasn't. He wasn't loud. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Even after people recognized Steven Seagal, that detail felt almost irrelevant. The name explained the how, but not the why. Because plenty of people have strength, plenty have training, plenty have power, very few have restraint. That's what unsettled the bikers the most. Once the adrenaline wore off. Not the pain, not the embarrassment, but the realization that the entire situation could have gone differently if they'd simply stopped, if they hadn't needed to feel bigger, if they hadn't mistaken silence for submission. One of them said later, quietly, to no one in particular, "He warned us." And that was the part no one could argue with. There had been no ambush, no trick, no escalation, just a boundary, clearly stated, calmly offered. Cross it, and consequences followed. Not emotional, not vengeful, just final. For the people who watched, the lesson landed in unexpected ways. Some thought about the last time they'd mocked someone who didn't fight back. Some remembered moments they'd stayed silent to avoid trouble, and were now grateful they had. Others realized how often they measured strength by noise, size, or aggression, and how often they were wrong. Because real confidence doesn't need witnesses. Real skill doesn't need approval. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits, it observes. And when it moves, it does so only once. The slap had been loud, the response had been quiet. And in the end, everyone remembered the quiet part more. That's why the story stayed with them. Not because someone hit the ground, but because someone didn't need to hit back harder than necessary. Because the most dangerous people aren't the ones looking for a fight. They're the ones who've already learned how to end one. The incident didn't end when the parking lot emptied. That was just when it began to change shape. By the next morning, the diner owner had already been asked about it 3 times. Not by police. By people who'd seen the video and wanted to know if it was real. "It is," he said each time, every second of it. The bikers involved didn't post, didn't comment, didn't argue online. One of them spent the night in the hospital with a dislocated shoulder and nerve damage in his arm. The other went home bruised and silent, replaying the moment again and again in his head. What haunted them wasn't the pain, it was the helplessness. They had built their identities around intimidation, around the belief that size and noise controlled outcomes. That belief had shattered in less than a second, and once it breaks, it doesn't go back together the same way. A few days later, one of them admitted something quietly to a friend. "I never even saw it coming." That sentence followed him longer than the injury. Paulus reviewed the footage carefully. Witness statements aligned. The slap was clear. The response was immediate and proportional. No excessive force, no pursuit, no retaliation after the threat ended. The report closed itself. Self-defense. Life moved on, but not evenly. At the diner, something subtle changed. People were kinder, quieter. When tensions flared, they dissolved faster, as if everyone had learned, without meaning to, That escalation wasn't inevitable. The waitress stopped flinching when customers raised their voices. She'd seen what calm could do. She carried that with her now. The trucker told the story one last time and then stopped. He didn't need to repeat it anymore. The lesson had settled. As for the man who'd driven away that afternoon, Steven Seagal, he never commented publicly. No interviews, no posts, no corrections. He didn't need to. For him, the moment wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about ending a situation cleanly. And that's the difference most people missed. He hadn't walked away because he was merciful. He hadn't stayed calm because he was afraid. He'd stayed calm because he understood something most people never learn. That control is always a choice. Weeks later, one of the bikers rode past the diner alone. He didn't stop, just slowed, glanced at the spot where it happened, and kept going. He didn't feel angry. He felt grateful, because the situation could have gone so much worse. Because he'd been allowed to walk away alive. Because the line had been drawn before irreversible damage was done. Consequences aren't always punishment. Sometimes, they're clarity. The incident didn't turn anyone into a hero or a villain. It stripped away illusions. About strength. About dominance. About what really matters when things go wrong. And for the people who had been there, who had felt the air change, who had seen noise dissolve into silence, it left a permanent impression. That power doesn't live in the slap. It lives in the restraint that follows. That respect isn't demanded. It's practiced, especially when no one's forcing you to. And that the most meaningful consequences aren't the ones written in reports or handed down by authority. They're the ones that change how you move through the world afterward. Quieter. More aware. More careful about the lines you choose to cross. Because once you've seen how fast everything can change, you don't need to test it again. Stories like this usually get remembered for the wrong reason. People focus on the moment bodies hit the ground. They replay the second where power shifts hands. They argue about strength, technique, and who would win if it happened again. But that was never the point. The real moment, the one that mattered most, happened before any movement at all. It was the moment when a man chose not to escalate, when someone stood still instead of reacting, when silence was chosen over noise, when ego was set aside long enough for clarity to take over. That's the part most people miss. Because the world teaches the opposite. It teaches that respect comes from volume, that dominance is proven through force, that if someone challenges you, you must respond immediately, or lose something permanent. But that afternoon outside the diner told a different truth. It showed that real strength doesn't rush, real confidence doesn't shout, and real power doesn't need permission to exist. The slap wasn't just an insult, it was a test of impulse, a test of identity, a test of whether strength would be used to impress or to protect. And the response, measured, brief, and final, answered that test without turning it into a performance. Long after the story faded from conversations and feeds, what remained was a quiet recalibration in the people who had witnessed it. They walked a little differently after that, listened a little more closely, paused just a fraction, longer before reacting. Because once you see how fast arrogance collapses, you stop feeding it. And that's where the real ending lives. Not in bruises, not in headlines, but in awareness. For some, the lesson was simple. Don't underestimate people who don't announce themselves. For others, it was deeper. Don't confuse restraint with weakness. And for a few, it was uncomfortable. Recognize the moments when you might have been the one crossing a line, laughing too loud, pushing too far, assuming too much. Because most conflicts don't begin with violence. They begin with disrespect. A joke that goes one step too far, a shove disguised as confidence. A slap, verbal or physical, mean to remind someone of their place. What decides the outcome isn't strength alone, it's self-control. That's what separated the noise from the silence that day. One side needed attention. The other needed nothing at all. And when the dust settled, only one walked away unchanged, not because he was untouched, but because he never let the moment own him. That's the kind of power that doesn't fade with age. The kind that doesn't depend on reputation. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. It's internal, earned quiet. So the next time you're tempted to test someone's limits, pause. The next time you mistake calm for weakness, rethink. And the next time you feel the urge to prove yourself, ask who you're really performing for. Because the strongest people in the room are rarely the loudest. They're the ones who don't need to remind anyone who they are. They already know,